Part of the reason it's useful to know what your traits are is because it can help you figure out how you should orient your life. Like, so for example, if you're high in extroversion, you've got a proclivity towards sales, for example. You're going to like occupations where you have a lot of opportunity for social interactions and social networking. You're not going to be happy if your job requires you to sit alone for extended periods of time and work in the absence of social interaction. You're going to be one of those annoying people then in one of those offices that instead of sitting alone in their office is going from doorway to doorway, engaging everyone in conversation, right? So, and you want to be in a position that capitalizes on your traits because it's really difficult to work contrary to your traits. The other thing that's worth thinking about too, we've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one, they're often fine, but in a group, they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so, if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want, whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right, but I think I've got it about right. What that means fundamentally, just so you have some sense of how large an effect that is that if you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. So it isn't so much that industriousness makes them happy or fills them with positive emotion. That would be more extroversion, right? Because extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. It's that industrious people can't stand sitting around doing nothing. And this is speculation, but human beings are obviously always engaged in the exchange of labor, especially the reciprocal exchange of labor. And you can imagine that in a community where everyone knows everyone, the people who work hard are going to be pretty irritated on a fairly chronic basis with the people who are completely unproductive. And my suspicions are that plenty of people who were completely unproductive in the history of the evolution of our species were wiped out by people who were unhappy with their lack of productivity. And so I think, generally speaking, human beings have this sense of ethical obligation with regards to one another to share labor. And people who are conscientious really, really feel that. So they feel bad if they're not busily working on something that's productive all the time. And so the advantage to being with someone conscientious is, well, they're going to work like mad, but the disadvantage is they're going to work like mad. So, if you're looking for a partner that you want to relax with or have fun with, or who isn't uptight, then a conscientious person is probably not a very good choice. On the other hand, if you're a conscientious person and you're living with someone who's really unconscientious, that's good because they might be able to help you relax, but you're not going to be happy with them because they don't work nearly as hard as you do. But even worse, on the orderly dimension, you know, some of you have had roommates and maybe you're more orderly than your roommate. What does it mean? It means you're annoyed by mess before they are. And you don't have to be annoyed by mess much before your less orderly roommate for you to be the one that's always running around picking things up. And so actually one of the things that's emerged from the psychometric analysis is that women are slightly more orderly than men. And I suspect that has something to do with what would you call it, inequitable distribution of housework. Imagine that your proclivity is to be triggered by disorder 25 seconds before your partner's. Well, it doesn't take much difference for you to be the one that's always concerned about the mess first. Anyways, and so if you're a really orderly person and you live with a disorderly person, well, good luck getting along with them. They're going to regard you as like uptight and over concerned with details and, well, and unwilling to relax, that's for sure. And they're going to regard you as, well, just a bloody mess. And how can anyone possibly live with someone like you? And so another reason why it's useful to understand your personality is because I think it gives you a better crack at finding someone that you can actually live with over the long run. And I don't think you want to live with someone who's exactly like you, because then both of you have the same strengths and weaknesses. And there's a bit of a problem there, right? Because maybe an agreeable person can use a bit of a disagreeable person around them to balance each other out, and vice versa, right? So we don't understand the optimal balance for long-term thriving in a relationship, but I think we do understand the fact that if you're too different in your traits, where you're different is going to constitute a chronic source of conflict. The question to some degree is, how do you help someone that's lost? And the answer to that is, if they aren't willing to not be lost, you cannot help them. And I would also say that as a clinician. You see, it's a statement that's informed, I would say, by my mythological knowledge, but also by straight clinical wisdom, not mine particularly. I mean, one of the things that Carl Rogers pointed out was that there were necessary preconditions for entering into a therapeutic relationship. And that would be really any relationship where the mutual flourishing of the two people involved was the paramount goal. And one of the preconditions was that both people had to want that to happen. And Rogers believed he didn't know how to get the horse to drink once you had brought it to the water. And I've thought about that a lot, because when people are really lost, sometimes they're so lost that they can't be found. And I think the only thing that you can do in a situation like that is get your life together and manifest the reality of an alternative mode of being. That's what you've got. And so that's the only way I know of to solve an intractable problem. There's a statement in the New Testament that's really vicious. In fact, there's a number of them, but this is a particularly vicious one. And that is, don't cast pearls before swine. And what that means is, if you're trying to help and it doesn't work, then stop helping. It's not helping, right? It may be just wasting your time. It might be making things worse. Now, if you're offering something and it's not taken, then perhaps you should be offering it somewhere else. And sometimes, if you offer a hand and the person won't take it, you have to stop offering the hand. And then what you do is you go off and you have your life. And sometimes that means in people's lives, for example, that they have to leave their family members behind. There's a scene in the New Testament, this is another very harsh scene, where Christ is walking down the road with his disciples. I hope I've got this story right, but I've got it essentially right. And his mother calls to him and says, I believe that he's supposed to come back to the home because his uncle has died and that there's going to be a funeral. And he turns to his mother and says something like, let the dead bury their dead. I'm about my Father's business. It's something like that. And you read that and you think, that should have been edited out. No, but it shouldn't have been edited out, because it's exactly right, because sometimes the thing you do is walk away because there's no other solution. And if you are trapped in pathological relationships and you see no way out of them, if someone who is sinking has their hands around your neck and is pulling you down, you're not obligated to drown with them. You know, there's a rule too, if you're a lifeguard, some of you have had lifeguard training. How do you approach someone who's drowning and panicking in the water? Feet out, right, like this. It's like, I'll save you, but that doesn't mean you get to drown me while I'm doing it. And if it's you drown or both of us drown, it's you drown. And that's wisdom. That's not cruelty, right? So, yeah. Should move forward in time with me, and what should be let go as if it's dead wood. The more dead wood that you let go of and burn off when you have the opportunity, the less it accretes around you. Here's something interesting about forest fires, you know. People have been trying to prevent forest fires for a long time, especially that damn bear, Smokey, right? Because forest fires burn up the forest, and that can't be good. But here's what happens if you don't let forest fires burn. Well, forests collect a lot of dry branches, right? Because tree branches die and wood falls on the forest floor and collects. And so the amount of flammable material keeps increasing with time. And that's not so bad if it's wet, but if the amount of flammable material is increasing and it gets really dry, and then it burns, then you have a real problem. The forest fire can burn so hot that it burns the topsoil right off, in which case you don't have a forest at all anymore, you just have a desert. And lots of trees are evolved to withstand forest fires of a certain intensity, and some won't even release their seeds unless there's been a fire. And so a little bit of fire at the right time can stop everything from burning to the ground. And that's also a really useful insight, a metaphorical insight into the nature of sacrifice, right? It's also a lot easier to let go of something when you're deciding to let go of it, because you've decided yourself that you're done with that. It's a weak part of you. It needs to disappear. You do that yourself, it's much better and much easier than it is if it's taken away from you forcibly, in which case you're very much likely to fight it. You know, a lot of what people regard as their own personalities and are proud of about their own personalities aren't their own personalities at all. They're useless idiosyncrasies that differentiate them trivially from other people. They have no value in and of themselves. They're more like quirks. I remember once I was trying to teach a particularly stubborn student about how to write. And she had written a number of essays in university and got universally walloped for them. And the reason for that was she couldn't write, really at all. She was really, really bad at writing. And so I was sitting down with her trying to explain to her what she was doing wrong. And she was being very annoying about it, very recalcitrant, very, very unwilling to listen. That was a pearls before swine thing, you know. And at one point she said, I can write perfectly well. This university professors just don't like my style. And I thought, what the hell's with you? You can't even write and you think you have a style. Instead of humbling herself, she was proud of her insufficiency. That's arrogance, right? That's not humility. It's self-deception and arrogance. To be proud of your insufficiency, that's a very foolish thing. And that means to cling to the parts of you that are dead. You know, as you elevate your aim, you create a judge at the same time, right? Because the new ideal, which is an ideal you, even if it's just an ideal position that you might occupy, even if it's still conceptualized in that concrete way, that becomes a judge because it's above you, right? And then you're terrified of it maybe. That's why you might be afraid when you go start a new job, right? This thing is above you and you're terrified of it and it judges you. And that's useful because the judge that you're creating by formulating the ideal tells you what's useless about yourself, and then you can dispense with it. And you want to keep doing that, and then every time you make a judge that's more elevated, then there's more useless you that has to be dispensed with. And then if you create an ultimate judge, which is what the archetypal imagination of humankind has done, say, with the figure of Christ, because if Christ is nothing else, he is at least the archetypal perfect man and therefore the judge. You have a judge that says, get rid of everything about yourself that isn't perfect. And of course, that's also what God tells Abraham, right? He says to be perfect, to pick an ideal that's high enough, and you can do this. The thing that's interesting about this, I think, is you can do it more or less on your own terms. You have to have some collaboration from other people, but you don't have to pick an external ideal. You can pick an ideal that fulfills the role of ideal for you. You can say, okay, well, if things could be set up for me the way I need them to be, and if I could be who I needed to be, what would that look like? And you can figure that out for yourself, and then instantly you have a judge. And I also think that's part of the reason people don't do it, right? Why don't people look up and move ahead? And the answer is, well, you know, you start formulating an ideal, you formulate a judge, it's pretty easy to feel intimidated in the face of your own ideal. That's what happens to Cain versus Abel, for example. Then it's really easy to destroy the ideal instead of to try to pursue it, because then you get rid of the judge. Lower the damn judge if it's too much. Like if your current ambition is crushing you, you know, then maybe you're playing the tyrant to yourself, and you should tap down your ambitions, not get rid of them by any stretch of the imagination, but at least put them more reasonably within your grasp. You don't have to leap from point 1 to point 50 in one leap, right? You can do it incrementally. But I really like this idea. I think it's a profound idea that the process of recapitulating yourself continually is also the process of, it's a phoenix-like process, right? You're shedding all those elements of you that are no longer worthy of the pursuits that you're valuing. And then I would say the idea here is that as you do that, you shape yourself ever more precisely into something that can withstand the tragedy of life and that can act as a beacon to the world. That's the right way of thinking about it. Maybe first to your friends and then to your family. It's like it's a hell of a fine ambition, and there's no reason that it can't happen. You know, every one of you knows people who are really bloody useful in a crisis, and people that you admire, right? You can think of all those people that you admire as partial incarnations of the archetypal Messiah. That's exactly right. And the more that that manifests itself in any given person, then the more generally useful and admirable that person is in a multitude of situations. And we don't know the limit to that. But people can be unbelievably good for things, you know. It's really something to behold. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? Well, those are famous lines, and that's sort of Christ the hippie, right? It's like, hey, let it all hang out. That's an old phrase. Do your thing, and everything will come to you. And these lines have been interpreted in that manner many times, but that's seriously not the proper interpretation, because there's a kicker with this injunction. And the kicker is this: for your heavenly Father knows that you have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. That's a lot different than the hippie thing, right? Because there's a very, very, very interesting idea here. It's certainly one of the most profound ideas that I've ever encountered. And the idea is this: if you configure your life so that what you are genuinely doing is aiming at the highest possible good, then the things that you need to survive and to thrive on a day-to-day basis will deliver themselves to you. That's a hypothesis, and it's not some simple hypothesis, right? Because what it basically says is, if you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either, because just because it works for someone else, that's interesting and all that, but it's no proof that it'll work for you. You have to be all in this game. And so the idea is, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. It's like, that's actually a fairly important caution when you're talking about not having to pay attention to what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. What it's essentially saying is that those problems are trivial in comparison. And the probability is that if you manifest yourself properly in the world, that those things will come your way is extraordinarily high, and I believe that that's exactly right. I've watched people operate in the world, and I would say that there is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no more practical pathway to the kind of success that you could have if you actually knew what success was. And so that's what this sermon is attempting to posit. It's like in the story of Pinocchio. Geppetto wishes on a star. We talked about that a little bit. And so what Geppetto does is align himself with the metaphorical manifestation of the highest good he can conceptualize. He makes a commitment, let's say. He aims at the star, and for him the star is the possibility that he can take his creation, a puppet, right, whose strings are being pulled by unseen forces, and have it transform into something that's autonomous and real. Well, that's a hell of an ambition, you know, and we're wise enough to put that in a children's movie, but too foolish to understand what it means. It's such an interesting juxtaposition that we can both know that and not know it at the same time. You can go to the movie, you can watch it, and it makes sense, but that doesn't mean that you can go home and think, well, I know what that meant. Well, people are complicated, right? We exist at different levels, and all the levels don't communicate with one another, but the movie is a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is there's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. And then you might also ask yourself, and this is definitely worth asking, is do you really have anything better to do? And if you don't, well, why would you do anything else? Therefore, take no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. I spent a long time trying to figure out what that meant too, because it's another one of those lines that can easily be read as pro-grasshopper and anti-ant. You know, you remember the old fable of the grasshopper and the ant? Maybe not. The ant works and the grasshopper fiddles, and the ant has a pretty good time in the winter and the grasshopper dies. And so this is like a pro-grasshopper line, but it's not, because it says something else. It says that if you orient yourself properly and then pay attention to what you do every day, that works. I actually think that that's in accordance with what we have come to understand about human perception, because what happens is that the world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well, then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems, and if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim, and you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is, well, back to Noah. Well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile, because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. And you don't want to wait until the flood comes to start doing that, because if your ark's half built and you don't know how to captain it, the probability is very high that you'll drown. There isn't any difference between the fool and someone who's courageous, right, from an archetypal perspective. Abraham is a fool, obviously, when he starts his adventures. I mean, the story lays it out in that manner. He's far too old to be leaving home, for example. He's a late bloomer. You know, and then he has a lot of catastrophic adventures along the way. And certainly you could imagine that had you encountered him when he first encountered the famine in the land of strangers, when he first went out, the idea that he had followed his misguided intuitions would have been self-evident. But in the Abrahamic stories, there is this call to get out and do. And that's it. And the thing is that one of the things I've learned, to make it concretely, is that I've done a lot of different things in my life. And every time I did a new thing, I was a fool. I did it badly. I was an imposter, right? Because when you first start to do something, you don't know what you're doing. But that's okay. That's an acceptance of your vulnerability, right? And your ignorance. That's humility in some sense. The willingness to be a fool in the land of strangers. That's it. The willingness to be a fool in the land of strangers. And that's an act of courage. Because you also reveal your vulnerability to the world by stumbling around. But as long as you're stumbling forward, then you're going to move forward. Now, how do you do that more concretely? You aim at an ideal, right? And you aim at an ideal that's beyond you. Now, maybe you don't aim to begin with at an ideal that's so beyond you that you're crushed by its magnificence, you know? Maybe that's too demotivating to move you. But you could at least conceptualize yourself as the you that you are with fewer of the faults that you know of. And that's a good start. And I also think that's associated with the idea of humility. Take stock. Figure out how it is that you're not who you could be. And then move in that direction. And accept the consequences. You know, you're going to get slapped a lot. But maybe with each slap, you'll straighten up a little bit. Especially if you listen, even to the people who are slapping you. Because sometimes they're the ones who can reveal for you very quickly where it is that you're weak and insufficient, so that you won't have to be that way in the future.
Spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you, and to fully wrestle with them, and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them. You know, and you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well, because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it, because their presence radiates implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect.
If you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, 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 very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. If you're going to be a fighter, you have to want to win, and you have to want to hurt people. I mean, not for the sake of hurting them. That's what makes you different than an evil person. But you have to have that capacity. You have to develop that. And, you know, that's the step on the way to enlightenment, weirdly enough, because that isn't what people think.
People have been fed this diet of pablum, rights and impulsive freedom, for so long. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. And it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not in impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being, and to try to put your family together, and to try to serve your community, and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. And when you'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous. You don't treat adult men as if they're infants.
But the young men really need to hear this more, I think, is that you should be a monster. You know, because everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You know, you don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no. Wrong. You should be a monster, an absolute monster, and then you should learn how to control it. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
This is an interesting thing about the integration of the shadow, because recognizing yourself as the locus of evil, let's say, actually, in some sense, gives you far more respect for yourself, strangely enough, because the same respect that you might have for a wild animal or even a monster. So then maybe you learn to treat yourself differently. Like, I think this is particularly true with regards to the discipline of children. You know, if you know that you're a monster, and that will manifest itself in your life, consciously or unconsciously, and if it's unconsciously, it's not good, then you become better at disciplining children. And the reason for that is that you don't want to expose them to your dark side. And so if they behave and don't provoke you, which means they'll also behave for other people, then the monstrous part can stay in abeyance, and then that's great. But if you don't understand yourself as capable of wreaking havoc, and that can be the kind of havoc that unfolds over decades, right? Because if you're going to abuse a child, it's the primitive form of abuse is the physical abuse. The sophisticated form of abuse is the continual undermining of the child's courage across perhaps their entire life. And that there's a terribly monstrous element to that. And if you're not respected properly by the child, say, you will absolutely take revenge on them. And, you know, in some sense, that's the whole Freudian psychoanalytic story. It's not all of it, but you either have that or it has you. Those are the options. And you don't become safe by being castrated. If you're going to speak about something, you need to know a lot about it. You need to know 3 or 4 times as much as you're going to speak about at minimum. So first of all, you have to do your background research. You have to have multiple stories at hand that you can use to illustrate your point. And you have to have a point. You have to organize what you're talking about around a problem. So before I go on stage to speak on my tour, I always sit for half an hour, some of which involves usually about 5 minutes of anxiety. And I think, okay, there's a problem I'm trying to address tonight, a central problem or a theme. What is it? It might be courage, it might be responsibility, it might be meaning. That serves as an organizing principle. So that would be the point. And then basically I organize, say, a dozen stories around that, and I can kind of arrange them as a journey. And it's a journey that circles the main point. And so I'm trying to explore it, to say what I think about courage, let's say, but to take what I'm thinking farther than I've taken it already. And so then I can plot out, you know, little 5-minute stories that I have that are associated with courage. And then I can talk to the audience. And I would say, talk about what you know. Use your personal experience, because that's something that you're actually a master of. You can bring in other material, but it has to be tied to the real world through your own experience. Otherwise, it's not real. It's also very good to speak directly to the audience, to the individuals in the audience, because I'm always looking at a single person, one after another, and focusing on them and talking to them, just like you'd have a conversation with someone. And that way I can see if they're following along. And I'm always listening to the audience. What I really like to hear from the audience is no noise at all, silence. Because if the audience, especially, you know, if it's a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people, if the audience is dead silent, then I know that I'm on the right track. And the other thing I would say is, you're telling stories, so every fact that you relate, or every set of facts, has to be tied to a story. There has to be a meaningful output, which is something like, why is it important to your life that you know this fact? How is it related to how you're going to conduct yourself moving forward, or how you're going to see the world? Because that's kind of the essence of meaning. How does this fact change the way you perceive the world or act in the world? That's the meaning of the fact. And facts without meaning are dull. So you need to know that. You need to tell the truth. That's for sure. And I mean, for me, my talks are really, they're an attempt to explore a set of ideas in the most truthful way that I can manage. And that's also an adventure, because letting yourself speak freely about a topic, you don't always know where it's going to go. And so, but that also hooks in the audience, because they're along for the ride, right? And there's a risk. The risk is you might forget where you are, you might lose the thread, you might say something you regret, you might get confused. The talk should be a process of exploration, like a journey that you're taking the audience along on. It's the same when you're reading a novel. Like a great novel isn't exactly plotted out from beginning to end to begin with. The author is taking himself or herself and you on an intellectual adventure through the character development, and the characters have to be allowed to live and to express themselves, and the novel needs to unfold. It's like a colloquy between the conscious mind and the unconscious source of inspiration, and the novel is actually a journey through a characterological landscape, and the author shouldn't know where he or she's going to end up at the beginning. Same with an artist who's writing a song or a piece of music or a piece of visual art. There has to be play and exploration along the way. And so you also don't want to deliver an over-prepared talk, in my estimation, or at least that's not how I do it. You want to have a theme, you want to have a body of knowledge from which you can draw on, and then you want to be actively exploring the idea in front of the audience. And that's very gripping for everyone, including you. And you should learn something from the talk. It's an opportunity to think on your feet. Anyways, that's my style of lecturing. It's a trapeze act without a safety net, I would say. And that's part of what makes it gripping, is that there's a high probability of failure. And I would say with any performance that's going to be gripping, there has to be a high probability of failure. And that's why I don't speak with notes. If you speak with notes, which you might have to if you're a beginning speaker, then you cannot fail because you can always read the notes. And so there's a net. You'll fall in the net, but you won't die. But you'll never do anything spectacular. So that's the thing, is if you're going to do something spectacular, you have to take the risk. And if you're going to take the risk, you have to think on your feet. And then you also have to have something to think about. You have to be working on this material. You know, I've been working on the stuff I talk about for 30 years, for tens of thousands of hours. And so I have that reservoir of knowledge, I suppose. And whenever I read something new, I'm slotting it into the knowledge structure that I use to generate my talks. And I'm reading all the time. And lots of the things I read, I forget. They're not relevant to my central mission, whatever that happens to be. Look, something like the delineation of the relationship between responsibility and meaning, and maybe responsibility, meaning, and perception. It's something like that. And so I have a central concern, or deeper than that in some sense. My central concern was how to ensure personally that if I was tempted in a situation like the situations that arose in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, that I wouldn't fall prey to those totalitarian systems and act in the reprehensible manner that so many people acted in. That's really been a driving concern of mine. And that bleeds over into the relationship between meaning and responsibility and perception. So there's a core set of problems that I'm working on, and every talk is an attempt to further develop those. So you also have to have a problem, you know? You think, well, you don't want to have a problem. It's like, yeah, you do. You've got problems anyways. If you're alive, you've got problems. Pick one of them. It can be your problem, and that can be the problem you try to address, whatever that happens to be. And then you have something to talk about. How am I going to address this problem? How can this problem be addressed? So you need to have a problem, too, if you're going to talk, just like you need to have a problem if you're going to write, because the writing is an attempt to solve the problem, and so is the talking. If you're not trying to solve a problem, what the hell are you doing talking? Why should anyone care? It's got to be a real problem, too, like a nail biter of a problem, a dragon of a problem. And if it's a problem that everyone else shares, so much the better. And then you grapple with it.
The role of the victim, which is a painful role to have, because something bad happened to you to be a victim. Mm-hmm. But it's something that society struggles with. What about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. They're victimizers too. Like, everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. Illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it. Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existentialists, especially in the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy.
But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past or perhaps of the present. Now, and no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. There's no better, you've got no better protection in life than doing that. These people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. What that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief. Beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive, and the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum. You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of, because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. One of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win.
The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. And there is something to be said for virtue and truth. You know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life. And you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. You got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. If you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. Why is it that smart people are at the top of dominance hierarchies? And the answer to that in part is because they get there first, right? I mean, everything's a race, roughly speaking, and the faster you are, the more likely you are to be at the forefront of the pack. And intelligence in large part is speed. That's not all of it is. So if you're moving towards something difficult rapidly, the faster people are going to get there first. You're going to have to put some effort into your life, and you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use, because that's a good place to auger down. And that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation. Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. Even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. It's important, because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. And some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1. What happens at the beginning of the Abrahamic stories is basically God comes to Abraham and just says, go. Get going, man. Do something. Get going. And you might think, well, where should I go? And God is somewhat vague about that. And where he sends Abraham, it's a real fixer-upper, man. It's like there's starvation there, and there's tyranny, and there's marital dissolution, and there's deceit. Like, it's just like where you live, it's exactly the same thing. it's tyranny and catastrophe. So that's the tyrannical great father, because Abraham ends up having to sojourn in Egypt, and there's a famine, and so Mother Nature is on the rampage, and Abraham lies about his wife, as we'll see. And so it's the world, it's tyranny and vulnerability and deceit. And yet God says, go, because if you do go, then you'll become a father of nations. And you think, well, again, that's pretty good news, although it's strange, because you'd expect that if God chose Abraham, then he'd send him immediately to the land of milk and honey, and that isn't what happens at all. It doesn't happen at all. And Abraham never gets there. But his mission is still regarded as divine. And thank God for that, because that's what your mission will be, because that's what you will encounter in your life. Those are the archetypal things everyone encounters. The tyranny of the social structure, and the rapaciousness of nature, and the deceitful quality of the human psyche. It's like, that's the world. Now, that's a negative view in some sense, but it's positive in the story, because what it basically says is something that's akin to the Sermon on the Mount, which is that if you're aligned with God, and you pay attention to the divine injunction, then you can operate in the midst of chaos and tyranny and deception and flourish. And you could hardly hope to have a better piece of news than that, given that that's exactly where you are. So, and I didn't see any of that in the Abrahamic stories to begin with, so it's been very interesting to have that sort of reveal itself. And one of the things that has just blown me away in the last year, because I've talked to lots of people live, but also lots of people online, but it's more obvious live, and it's obvious in this theater as well, is that I've gone around and spoken, and a large proportion of my audience has been young men, under 30, something like that. And I've spoken to them a lot about responsibility. And what's so odd about this is that of all the things that I've spoken about, because I can see the audience and I can feel how the audience is reacting, because I'm always paying attention to all of you insofar as I can manage that. So I get some sense of how what I'm saying is landing, which you have to do if you're going to speak effectively to people. And what happens is, if I talk about responsibilities, everyone is silent, just like they are now. Silent and not moving, right? Focusing, attentive. Say, pick up your responsibility. Pick up the heaviest thing you can and carry it. And the room goes quiet and everybody's eyes open. And I think, that always makes me break up. I don't know why. I was speaking to an English journalist today who was going to write an article in Spectator magazine, and I was talking about this, and at the same point in the discussion, I had the same emotional reaction. I don't really understand it. I think there's something about it that's so crucial, because we've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong, and people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. It's that's the secret to a meaningful life, and without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that, and self-contempt, and that's not good. And it's necessary to stand up and take responsibility, and they all know that and are starving for that message. And the message is more that that's also a good thing, to stand up and take responsibility, because you're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul-deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news, So it's been really something to see that in the stories. So that's responsibility. It's not just that Abraham is kinder, gentler, more intrepid, ethical, or a better debater than his ancestor Noah. Rather, both the Noah and Abraham stories are pieces of a development of an increasingly stronger stance of humans relative to the deity. Before the story is over, humans will become a good deal stronger and bolder than Abraham. See, what happens as the story progresses is that Abraham and Sarah are eventually granted a son, but it's way late in the story and they're very, very old by the time it happens. And of course, you're not going to be a father of nations without having a child. And so the writers are attempting to make the case that if you forthrightly pursue that which God directs you to pursue, let's say, that all things are possible. That's the idea in the narrative. And you might say that's naive, and it's not. You think it when you're naive, right? And then you dispense with that idea. And then when you stop being the sort of person who dispenses with ideas, then you come to another place. And that's the place where you think you have no idea what might be possible for you if you got things together and pursued what you should pursue. You don't know how much what's impossible to you right now would become possible under those conditions. It's an unknown phenomena. And like, I've watched people who've put themselves together across time, incrementally and continually, and they become capable of things that are not only jaw-droppingly amazing, but also sometimes metaphysically impossible to understand. And so we don't know the limits of human endeavor. We truly don't. And it's premature to put a cap on what it is that we are, what it is that we're capable of. And so you're already something, and maybe you're not so bad in your current configuration. But you might wonder, if you did nothing for the next 30 years except put yourself together, just exactly what would you be able to do? And you might think, well, that's worth finding out. But of course, that's the adoption of responsibility. And one thing I've also learned over the years, because I've been curious about this battle between meaning and nihilism, and I could see for a long while the rationale in nihilism and the power of the nihilistic argument. But it occurred to me across time that despite that the power of the nihilistic argument is more powerful than naive optimism, it's not more powerful than the optimism that is not naive. Because the optimism that is not naive says it's self-evident that the world is a place of suffering and that there are things to be done about that. And it's self-evident that people are flawed and that there's things to be done about that. And then the non-naive optimist says the suffering could be reduced and the insufficiency could be overcome if people oriented themselves properly and did what they were capable of doing. And I do not believe that that's deniable. I think that human potential is virtually limitless, and that there's nothing perhaps that's beyond our grasp if we're careful as individuals and as a society. And so I think that there's no reason for nihilism, and there's no reason for hopelessness. And there's no reason to bow down before evil, because we're capable of so much more. And I think you know that first, because you're not happy with who you are and you're ashamed and embarrassed about it, as you should be. And you know it because if you look out there, you see people who are capable of doing great things, and you know that we're not giving it our all. And still we're not doing so badly, And so you might wonder, if we devoted 90% of our effort to putting things right instead of 55% of our effort, or maybe even less than that, you might wonder just how well could things be put together. And I think that you can figure that out by starting with your room, by the way.
Can you tell if the person you're in a romantic relationship with is the right person to spend the rest of your life with? You can't. You actually decide that rather than discovering it. I might suggest what you might look for on the way to making that decision. All things considered, a certain amount of similarity on the personality dimensions between the two of you is probably to be recommended. If you differ tremendously in trait conscientiousness, one of you is going to find the other unbearably rigid, orderly, and workaholic-oriented, and that person is going to find you dissolute and undisciplined. And those are temperamental differences, and if the gap is large, it's hard to bridge it. Agreeableness, it's the same thing. The warmer person will find the colder, harsher person cruel and unkind, and the cruel and unkind person will find the more agreeable person soft, a pushover, and contemptibly unable to stand up for themselves. The extrovert will want to be out partying all the time, and the introvert will have had his or her fill of that very rapidly. So you want some temperamental similarity across the major personality dimensions, with the possible exception of trait neuroticism, which is the generalized proclivity to experience negative emotion. I would suggest that a person high in neuroticism seek out someone low or very low, because first of all, neuroticism is one of the best predictors of unhappiness in a relationship. And so if you're both high in neuroticism, you're very likely to be unhappy in the relationship. And it's highly probable that the person who's higher in neuroticism needs the stabilizing influence of someone who's lower. Then I would say, well, this is based on my clinical observations as well as the experiences of my life. I think it's necessary, or at least highly desirable, that you find the person that you're with sexually attractive. And that's somewhat ineffable. You can be confronted with two people who are, by objective standards, equally attractive, or perhaps equally unattractive, and find yourself very physically attracted to one of them while the other one will leave you cold. And that's a deep mystery. And I've seen couples who get along as friends, try to bridge that romantic gap by will. And I haven't really seen it be successful. So I think you need that spark that ignites sexual passion. Then you have to ask yourself if you can trust the person, if there are activities that you can share with them that would make up a life, if you're oriented in approximately the same direction with regard to your goals, especially important goals, career and children being foremost among them, if you think you could come to some agreement about how the economic resources could be distributed, or at least how that might be negotiated, if you can negotiate with the other person, and again, if you can trust them. And I would say of all those, trust is the most crucial component, maybe followed by the ability to negotiate. The right person is someone you can negotiate with, because there's going to be differences between you and them. There's going to be differences in your approach. There should be, hopefully there'll be, because that means that the two of you are bringing different skill sets to bear on the problem. That means that you have a more diverse range of potential responses, which can be good, but also that there's going to be conflict. The issue then becomes, can you negotiate through the conflicts? And will the other person stick to their negotiated solution? And then if you find someone like that and they're of approximately the right age and everything else seems to be in order, then in some sense, they're as good a bet as the next person, and life doesn't last forever. And so there's real reasons to get on with it. You have to understand that even in the best relationships are predicated on attraction, trust, and negotiation. And it's constant. You're constantly negotiating to maintain the relationship, to expand it. You don't find the right person and live happily ever after. Life is far too complicated for that.
Do you have any practical advice on how I can improve my ability to concentrate and pay attention to the world around me? Often the devil's in the details, but some practical advice is, well, regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, or perhaps earlier, or perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that because your circadian rhythms operate more fluidly and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain, and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate I would say a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And because it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so regulating your sleep and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that spending some time scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. So the first thing I would say is that you should develop a long-term plan. You have to set up your vision, like Geppetto when he's looking at the star before Pinocchio's transformation takes place. You have to set up your long-term vision. To have some vision of the good towards which you're working, and some vision perhaps of the hell that you're avoiding. And then I would say, once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, well, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. And what I would say about that is that if you hate using a schedule or a calendar, then you're probably using it wrong. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with, we'll say, arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. Okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest. And so I would also say that the trajectory that you're on is more important than your starting point. And that's also an extraordinarily optimistic observation, because it means that direction is more important than current position. And I mean, current position matters, obviously, but I don't think it does matter as much as direction. So if you want to learn to concentrate more, define what constitutes concentration, break it into micro habits, and then start practicing instantiation of those micro habits.